Does suffering really make us stronger, or is it an outdated notion? This is a question that has provoked much thought and debate over the years. Some see suffering as a potent catalyst for personal growth, a crucible in which we are tempered and made resilient. It's a concept deeply ingrained in our collective psyche, often encapsulated by the saying, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." This perception of suffering as a necessary tool for growth, however, is being increasingly scrutinized and contested. Critics argue that suffering isn't always a means to an end, but sometimes merely an end in itself. They contend that not all suffering leads to personal development or strength, but can sometimes result in irreversible damage. And so we're left to ponder. But what if suffering isn't always useful? What if it's sometimes just suffering? Many argue that suffering is a crucial part of human experience. It's often suggested that the trials we face are akin to a blacksmith's forge, shaping and tempering us into stronger versions of ourselves. This perspective is echoed in maxims such as, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," implying that adversity is not just inevitable, but beneficial. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That our struggles, our pain, isn't meaningless, that it's actually serving a grand purpose. This viewpoint proposes that suffering is a necessary ingredient in the recipe for resilience, that it's the grit in the oyster that creates the pearl. It's a narrative that champions suffering as a catalyst for growth, a crucible for character development. But is this really the case, or is it a misconception we've been conditioned to accept? On the other hand, there's a growing argument that not all suffering is useful. This perspective challenges the notion that suffering is inherently beneficial, asserting that it's not about usefulness or uselessness. Instead, suffering should be classified as avoidable or inevitable. In this modern era, advancements in technology and societal norms have made many forms of what was once inevitable suffering avoidable. Let's consider dental procedures, for instance. A few centuries ago, the pain experienced during tooth extraction was deemed inevitable. A trip to the dentist was synonymous with discomfort and even dread. But fast forward to today, thanks to anesthesia, the same procedure is relatively painless. Now, imagine someone arguing for the strengthening power of suffering, suggesting you should endure a tooth extraction without anesthesia. Would you see the merit in their argument, or instead view it as unnecessary and avoidable suffering? Similarly, many human creations and activities like arts, games, and group activities can foster empowerment and strength, often with considerably less suffering or even no suffering at all. These activities, which involve engagement and fun, prove that suffering is not the only pathway to strength. So as we progress as a society, we develop ways to lessen or even eliminate certain forms of suffering. This raises an important question. So if we can avoid suffering, why should we embrace it? There's another aspect to consider. Who benefits from the belief that all suffering is useful? This is a question we must ask ourselves. The glorification of suffering is not a harmless belief, as it can be exploited by those in power to justify harm and oppression. Consider the tyrants of history, those who reigned with iron fists, subjecting their subjects to immense suffering. They justified their actions by saying that this hardship would ultimately strengthen the people. This belief was a tool for them, a means of manipulation, enabling them to continue their reign unchallenged. It is not just rulers who can exploit this belief. Abusive individuals, from schoolyard bullies to manipulative partners, can use the idea that suffering is strengthening to excuse their actions. They can argue that their abusive behaviors are not harmful, but rather beneficial, pushing their victims to become stronger. Even ideologies can exploit this belief. Those that promote suffering as a necessary part of life can perpetuate harm under the guise of growth. They can push individuals to endure unnecessary hardship, all while praising them for their supposed strength. This glorification of suffering, then, is not just misguided, it is dangerous. It can be used to justify harm, to excuse oppression, and to perpetuate abuse. So perhaps it's time we rethink the idea that all suffering is useful and instead focus on minimizing unnecessary pain.